Okay, so in previous class, we started talking about macros. Fine. So we saw that how exactly the macro is used. So let us try to recap what exactly we discussed that day. So we took example of a macro. So yeah, so we considered this example macro my add. So as I said, like there would be a particular template available for macro definition. Right, so you may note down somewhere like whenever a macro has a template, there could be possibly some keywords used while the macro definition is given. So whatever you see here, okay, this is a macro definition. Fine. Then the syntax for now, the syntax that you are seeing right now is of NASM assembler because we are using it. So NASM is a macro assembler. So now this definition uh, requires a keyword called macro, and towards end of the macro you have to write percent macro and percent in macro. Within that your macro definition would be added. As per syntax you have to mention macro name, okay, and then you have to specify how many possible variables could be. Correct. So say variables, I mean to say the parameters that you are passing for a macro. So for this example we are considering that there are only uh, two parameters. So these parameters, what this would be a count, like whatever two that you are seeing right now, this two is count of number of parameters that you are passing when the macro is given a call. So this whatever you see here is a definition, and whatever you see in text section is macro call. Correct? Is that fine? Moreover, whenever we have to refer these macro parameters, so these parameters are organized in some order. So depending upon the order that the macro definition, like the programmer who is writing this macro, what is the order that he or she is following to write the parameters would be referred by their position. So macro handles positional parameters. So the positional parameters are referred or used by making use of this percent sign along with the number. Correct. So for example, %1 refers to first argument that is passed. Okay. %2 here refers to second argument that is passed. Correct. Okay. Now this is a macro definition. Whatever we saw. Correct. This is macro definition, and in this case, as I stated, sorry, this is macro call. Now we even saw like what happens is when macro expansion is done. So expansion, I mean to say this macro call is replaced by its definition, the way that we saw. Say for example, if I write masm-eflf32 .asm, so simply write -e to get, say for example, what happens after expansion, macro expansion. Okay, so let us type there less. So what happens? The macro call, or sorry, macro definition is removed from that expansion phase. Okay, and the macro call is added there. So in this case, there was a macro here, macro call was there. Okay, in this case, that's why you do see these things, EAX and EDX, and add EX from ADI. So these three lines, these two lines are referring to the macro call. Same thing, like these two lines referring to a macro call, which are replaced by the definition. So it is simply find and replace. Now, as I stated earlier, like those who did theory of computation or are doing currently theory of computation, I assume Turing machine must be addressed. So if it is not, definitely it would be addressed by the teacher respectively. Now what happens is if you can think of that tape, okay, a read write tape. So the way that we identified that tape for finite automata as well as, for example, push down automata. So similarly with Turing machine, you have a tape. Now this tape is read and write. Correct. Now there is a head which can read as well as which can write. So on the tape you can read as well as you can read from and you can write to on the tape. And the read write head would be available, which will permit you reading parameters from the location on the tape and write values or value probably at the particular pair. Now think of this. Suppose if I am giving you language A raised to n, B raised to n, correct? And I want you to define or design a Turing machine. So what exactly you would be doing? So you have to first check A and then appropriately find the respective B. Again come back. So this would be this read and write head would be moving towards left as well as right. So same thing is applied within like the hard disk that you have. Correct. So it is kind of find and replace. Same thing we are doing here. Okay, so in some sense, some kind of Turing machine is definitely applied with this each and every algorithm that you use for find and replace. Correct. Now, like if the example that I gave before a while about a Turing machine, how will you remember that you addressed A and then you are going to find out appropriate B? So what you do generally is you replace A by X, say for example, and you try to find respective B so that you can replace it by Y. Now this would be for remembering which characters are replaced by S. Correct. That's what is happening here. When you see this EAX, ECX are added there because you are passing this ECX and ESI as a parameter in at this particular point to the macro. So the macro call, correct, for this case, say, okay, which was a replacement like this. Same thing was done here too. Your parameters are EDX and EDI. So if you see carefully the code, you will see that first parameter is EDX and EDI, and second set of parameters for second call is ECX and ESI. So like this is used. Now how like you may see how will you implement that Turing machine maybe as a transition diagram or a transition table so that you can remember what action is to be taken, what action we took and so on. So while writing or talking about assembler, we said that there would be some data structures used internally. Correct. And those data structures possibly would be like some of them are static, some of them are dynamic. Okay. Now what happens is like on the similar line, when we said static and dynamic data structures available for macro pre-processing, this phase occurs before you start pass one of two pass assembler or pass like first pass of one pass assembler or the pass of one pass assembler. Correct. It should be pre-processing should happen. And that's why for pre-processing, it makes use of two data structures. So let me open a spreadsheet so that I can show you how I would be using those data structures. Okay, I will share this one. So now you have two data structures called macro name table. So generally referred as MNT, and second data structure is macro definition table. Correct. So macro name table and macro definition table. Now think of this. So sorry. Yeah. Yeah. So let me take example of that macro definition now. So if I write this. Now you will see like when we start reading this file, correct? Suppose this input, this file is given as an input. Now I am assuming that you are designing this find and replace for macro call and macro definition, correct? So there would be two passes. One information is collect all macros definitions that you have in the code. So your target would be what? Try to find out this and try to find out this. Okay, when you get this first time, whatever you get here, so this would be name. So enter that name. So for example, macro name, correct? You may have serial number probably there or some identity. So index, say for example, so this is index number 1. Okay, macro name, say for example, my ad. Now it will have count of arguments. So it has 2, correct? And now address. Now this refers to the macros which are stored in the definition table. Now how will you store in the definition table? So you don't know how many lines are there. For example, with the macro that I had right now, my add, how many lines does that macro is having? In this case, my add macro, how many lines that macro is having as a part of definition? Yes, somebody, anybody can tell
Two
me how?
lines.
2 lines, correct? We have only 2 lines, correct? So that means if I take another example that we took that day, if I take this example, you will see that the macro that I defined here, the number of lines are more 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Correct. So that macro can have any number of say lines. Then how exactly I do store this? So think of this. You have a linked list. OK, or you have contiguous set of memory. Say, for example, this is whole memory area. So marked with 1, 2, 3. Each location is say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And suppose I have 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I'm writing them into so that I can fit it within the boundaries. Correct. Yeah. So that even it would be visible. So now think of this like these are the macro. Say this is a space given to store the definition. So what I do is I start writing whatever the code that I got here. Say for example, if I go to this, so I got what? My add. So I wrote that entry into my add here in this case. OK, I wrote number of arguments. Now I'm writing address of it as 1. Now what I will do is I will go here. Now this what are the numbers that I wrote here 1 to 14? They are referring to the definition. OK, now I will start writing this move ex comma %1. Now each line I'm assuming that is represented through a location. So add ex comma %2. Now here my definition is ended. So I will have address, correct, which specifies that my macro starts here. Now suppose I get another macro, so which says my sub. Now this also has 2 arguments. So now next address would be where I will have 3. Correct. Add this 3. Sorry, I should have written it here. I have 3. Now say number of lines are occupied by it are 4. Assumption. Correct. So these are the 4 given for my sub. I get now this my sub my add. I'm assuming that I'm getting them in the source code. Assumption. So I got third macro. Suppose it is my mul. This has 5 arguments. OK, and number the start address is 7. Correct. Now from 7, my macro starts. This definition would be starting. Correct. So this is how my tables would be populated. Correct. So you can have starting position, ending position, and so on. Now there will be 2 phases. One is collecting macro definitions and populating the MNT and MDT. This is MDT that I was talking about. So let me write this here. Now suppose this is my macro name table. OK, now this address refers to the entry in this macro definition table. So this is MDT. Now these are my dynamic data structures. Both of them are dynamic data structures. Now first step in macro processing is what? Read the file. Whatever the source file is given to you. Collect macro names. So whenever you get %macro, add that entry here. So I added 1, my add number of arguments are 2. And now I am going to store the definition. So I will write here 1. At the same time, when this entry is made, I will go here Now somewhere I would be collecting what is the next address to be used. Okay, when it ends. Suppose like there would be some variable which is pointing to that particular location of MDT. Like for example, whenever you are working with linked list, you take generally an head kind of variable. Okay, where you do collect or you do store start address of it. So that start address is known, or whatever the element that is available at the whatever the address that is available later stage. That's what you say next. Correct. So you do store these addresses. Similarly, I am doing the same thing. Correct. So suppose I stored my first then I will go to this location 1 in MDT and I will add the source lines available until I find %n macro. Now when I find %n macro, then I will stop writing this. I will move further by keeping this value as a next like 3. Correct. Now suppose if I get from the source code again %macro anywhere in the code, anywhere in the code, then what I will do? I will write it as myself. Now second entry, for example, if my macro is 2. Now let me make some small changes to show you how this expansion is done. So in this case, I hope you must have understood how this my add would be replaced by now or how that call would be replaced by the definition. Now I haven't talked about it in the programming sense, rather the way that I wrote here. Only one step I wrote here. Correct. I said collecting macro definition and populating. Okay, let me correct this. Populating means add the entries into MNT and MDT. That's what our first stage is. Correct. Now, suppose let me take this example. Let me modify this a bit so that I can show you now where the definition possibly could be. The sample example that we took that day on 30th. So what was the case? The thing was like you are assuming that the macros are occurring before the text section starts. That's what say is shown here. Correct. Now what happens if I take that macro in a different manner? Now what I will simply do is I will remove this and I will add it here. Okay, now let us see what happens. Okay, now let me assemble this code. Nasm-f ALF32. Sorry, 03. Let me write dash e and say pipeless. Can you see that macro got expanded or not? Do you see anything happened there? Do you see macro got expanded? Yes or no? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Do you see macro got expanded or not? Is it expanded? See my definition. I wrote this definition after section.txt, correct? So when I try assembling this, suppose if I don't add this, I get an error. Because it starts working with the case. Like why hasn't it started that expansion phase? So when it says dot text, section.txt, it doesn't care whether the macros are available or not. That expansion page is completely rejected. And then you will see that when my add was addressed 2 times, it is giving you an error. That means what? You are not permitted to write the macro definition after the section.txt. Is that fine? Now let me take this here. Okay, and inside this, let me add something. Can you see what I'm doing? Can somebody tell me what I'm exactly doing? It is similar to what you do is like in a function definition, you write another function definition like a block. Correct. So that's what I'm doing here. Fine. And let me replace it by sub. Let us see now. Now, do you see macro got expanded? Yes. That my sub was replaced here and my add was replaced here. So though I wrote the definition of macro like this, macro inside a macro. So nested macro definition. What I'm doing here is nested macro definition. So is it permitted? Probably NASM is permitting this. And that's the reason why it could translate it successfully. It could translate it successfully. And that if you see like the original definition of my source code, I wrote my add here. OK, and I wrote my sub here. Right, and each respective macro was replaced. So if I try to say display, okay, that is not generated. So let me generate this. I see only main there. The reason behind the pre-processing was done, then NASM was completely macros were completely destroyed. They are not in memory right now, and we don't have any relation with that either of the table like macro definition or macro name. What currently we have after generating object code from a 2-pass assembler is only symbol called main. Rest of the things are not available because we don't have anything called as data section and we don't have anything called as PSS or probably arrow data. Now what procedure might have been applied here to show this code probably because our data structure is going to fail somewhere here because how will I know that where my second definition starts? In this case, as I already wrote this, that's why I could understand where exactly my definition is. Now, how will you do this? Probably say like the strategy I told earlier, like if nested macro definition is not there the way that I have shown here, then it is very easy. What you do, you read this macro, add each line in the macro definition table, done. But when you see this kind of stuff, what exactly you are going to do? Now think of this. I hope some of you must have written a code which maps say these what you can call it as a parenthesis matching or round bracket matching. I hope most of you must have written this kind of code in your data structure course rather. Now what you do generally, you don't start with this say for example this bracket opening bracket. No, you first reach to this closing bracket and then you come back and then say yes, now this is matched. So same thing is to be done here whenever you are talking about nested macro definition. Correct. Now if it is not a nested macro definition, then whatever the solution that I gave right now here is perfectly fine. But when it is with the nested macro definition, then there is a problem. I cannot store my first macro like this the way that I stored. So suppose now I am talking about nested macro definition. So this would be deleted. Sorry. This would be deleted. Now how exact? Now again, this would be deleted. How exactly it will start? Now it will start by reading this code. What is the code that you have? So it should find out where is percent in a macro. When it gets that percent in a macro, it goes to the recent percent macro. then it gets first my sub. Now let us assume that whenever there is a nested macro, then instead of my add, now it would be my sub. Correct. Now number of arguments are 2 and it says 1. Now your my sub would be written here. Now this is done. So this gets deleted from there, from the source code. Okay, which is a temporary file, because it already added that definition and name in the table. Now it removes this from here so that it can get plain definition of my add instead of having another macro definition included there. So if I assume what happened was like this definition was removed because its entry was made in my macro name and macro definition table. Then I will again start with finding end macro. I got end macro here. I will go back. I will find percent macro and I will add these 2 lines here. So now I got in this table, I got another entry. Same I add. Number of arguments are 2 and start. Sorry, this address was 1 and now I would be getting addresses 3. Correct. And from 3 now my add would be stored. And that's how the procedure could be. So it would be difficult rather whenever you have this nested macro definition permitted in the code. Now it was with respect to if I have to work with these 2 data structures, MNT and MDT. But what exactly might be happening at the time of expansion? So now like this pass 0 of macro preprocessor contains 2 sub steps. First step is what? Collect. So the way that I wrote here. So this is my first step. Now second step is, so it is called as definition phase. Now we have expansion phase. In expansion, what is to be done? So you are going to start with section.text. You are going to read this one, read this one, read this one. Every time you are going to compare this first name that you get at every line, the first word that you get every line, you are going to compare that with your MNT. This, whether it finds XOR, whether it finds move, whether it finds move. Now it got my add. Yes, my add is in. So where is my add? My add. It got it. So it started at starting address is 3. Sorry, here. So it goes to location number 3. Now what it does, it sees what are the parameters given EDX, EDI. So it sees what is the code EAX comma %1. What was the first parameter? EDX. So it writes that line in the source code here. So this would be replaced now. So now with assumption, like as these definitions are written, this would be deleted from source code. Now this call is to be replaced by the respective line. So for example, move EAX comma EDX and add EAX comma EDI. Done. So this is expansion of this line. Now this line also would be removed from the source code because we don't want any footprints of the macros, because this would be first phase of macro. So this is path 0, which is always added with your any of the 2 pass assembler or 1 pass assembler. Is this okay? Any questions, queries? So this expansion phase is really tricky. What is to be done? Replace macro call by definition by making replacements of positional parameters provided in macro call. Correct? Now with assumption that suppose you replaced all the definitions, sorry, all the calls are replaced by your definitions. Okay, now you got sub uh, EAX comma ESI. Now, though I am writing this as semicolon, but actually they are deleted. There no footprint of either of the macro definition or macro call is kept in the source line. Is that fine? Any question? Yes, please. Have you understood this? Those who haven't understood can raise your hands so that I can at least, because you are not unmuting yourself. It would be good if I can see if you raised hands. Those who haven't understood can raise your hands so that I can see whether do you have any question there? Or otherwise assumption would be what? You understood everything whatever I tried doing. Yeah, Tushar, tell me what is the problem?
Sir, the macro inside macro.
Okay. So I assume now it is clear to you like with assumption that it is not a macro inside a macro for a while. Correct? So that macro call would be replaced by macro definition. Fine. So let me open that file again. With assumption, yeah, macros are there. Now this is nested macro definition. Now, what exactly it means? You are having definition of a macro inside a macro. Now let me show you one interesting fact. Okay, let me save this and let me go out. Now carefully see this code. Okay, now I wrote a back bracket. Then I am writing something. Now while I am writing this closing bracket, try to see that it is matching with the opening bracket. Okay, have you seen that? It was for fraction of time. See here. Could you see this? It is matching with the opening bracket. Now suppose I have this bracket, and if I pass on this, now see which with bracket it is happening. I am adding second one. I am adding third one. I am adding fourth one. Can you see that blue background? I assume it is blue. Have you seen that background? See, 1, 2, 3, 4. Is it matching with the brackets? This is intelligence of Emacs. Which exactly is matching the parenthesis that you are writing or the round bracket that you are writing. When I wrote this, it matches with the current opening one, latest opening one. It doesn't match with the first. Has it matched with this first? No, it matched with the latest one. Now, if you see, these are nested parentheses. Am I right? Are they nested parentheses? So you generally see with the expression. Say, for example, if I write E is equal to A plus B multiplied by C minus D divided by E. D divided by 3. Now see the brackets. Huh? Now while I'm matching them. The first, second, third. Have you seen that? Now suppose if I don't write this, then it is, should be error because see when I mapped this, it is showing with the second. Now suppose you are giving this as an input to your code and verify whether this given thing is correct or not. So ultimately, as you saw one opening bracket, now as per your strategy of using stacks, you will be storing these opening brackets, 3 opening brackets into the stack. So suppose you got this, this and this. Suppose this is a stack. So when you get first, you are going to remove this top. correct? Removed. You get second, you remove this top, the second entry. Now top is here. Top of the stack is here. Now you do see there is an element in a stack, but you don't find any bracket there. Ultimately, this is a wrong expression. This is not as per the syntax of expression that should have been used. That should have been used there. And that's how exactly the syntax matching, syntax verification would be done probably. And I'm trying to apply the similar strategy by adding a nested macro definition here. Though this is not somewhat powerful or useful in any sense. It is not making any impact, but if suppose you are given this kind of macro definition, what will you do? What should be your strategy? Because like the data structure that I took here, okay, here earlier, if you recall, when I wrote my add, when there was no nested macro definition, I simply started by writing my add there, number of arguments to be 2 and my address was 1. But when I suddenly see this code, which contains nested macro definition, then I cannot go by writing this my add there directly. So first of all, I will try to find out this end macro. Correct? This would be found by me. Now I'm not trying to find out, I'm not going with this, I'm trying to find out this. So when I get this, I go reverse. And then I will try to go to this my percent macro. Now how will you go about this then? Now assumption that suppose this is your file. You have to go to this. How exactly you will move your cursor here? So let us say these are a line numbers. So currently line number 1, suppose somewhere, let me take another example, another terminal. Now suppose I got this line number 1. So with that current variable, I will put L equal to 1. Line number 1. Now it will move further and see. Do you get percent macro? Suppose this would be written in temporary location because we got my add. But as we haven't got end macro yet, we got suddenly in between percent macro. So I will write now here. This would be 3. Assume that this is a stack. 1 is there because I already have one open macro definition, which is not closed yet. This my add is not closed. Theoretically, it would be, it seems really practical. But while implementing practically, it would be difficult. How exactly you will remember these things? So maybe you are trying to write this into temporary file for every macro definition that you get. Say, for example, you are creating one node and you are going to write it there. You got percent macro, you are writing somewhere else for my sub. Then you started writing there. Now, when you find percent end macro for first, okay, in this case, then you will remove this 3 because now that definition will be written in macro name table and macro definition table. Now earlier value, because this would be popped. Now you have, where was the line, first line, like first macro definition, it was at line number 1 from the source file. Here. Then it will, it actually wrote this. So it will try to find only this one and will reach to end macro. When it is done, automatically definition would be written at that place. Now, earlier example, when I talked without nested macro definition, I was parallelly writing definition into MDT. Now, whenever I have nested macro definition, I will not write that parallelly. I will take this into temporary location. And then when I see the complete definition of macro, then I will write it into macro definition table. Till that time, I will not write it. So it would be my decision as a developer, how should I store this nested macro definitions? Now, if you try to open, say, source code of NASM and try to see how exactly this is done, this is a really tough procedure or function written inside, which works with this definition and expansion phase. Definition and expansion phase. So until unless you chew it, rather you chew it multiple times, it will take some amount of time for you to really come up with how exactly you will implement this. So now, if you ask me, I'm not going to ask you, can you write a macro assembler which takes nested macro definition? I want you to make use of plain macros like this. They are not nested one. Then it would be easy for you, correct? Because considering the time required, and I don't know how, when will you come here, probably in the department, it would be very difficult to solve the problem that you might be facing with respect to such kind of programming. Okay, to handle definition inside a definition. So I hope you must have seen in databases. Okay, for example, I am saying struct as a data structure point of view. Huh? So I'm writing this as a structure, but let us assume that it is a table. So student. Now it's data structure. Integer, roll number, correct? Character, double star, name, or you say simply star name. Then you have struct address, character star address line 1, character star address line 2, correct? And then you have this bracket. Now you even can see in gedit it matches the brackets. And then you have say character, sorry, degree admitted to. So this is your structure definition. Now you will see structure definition inside the structure. That means what? This address actually is part of this data structure, but it itself is representing something else. So what you call this as in databases? Yes. What you call this as in databases? So here where we can call that address as a multi-valued attribute. Have you heard this term in databases or probably in ER diagram?
Yes, sir.
Correct. So multi-valued attribute of an entity is an attribute that can have more than one value associated with key of the entity. Multi-valued attribute. Correct. For example, if you talk about Maharashtra Bank, how many branches are? So branch name I am talking about. So this can have multiple values. I don't know what exactly it is. Fine. So I'm talking about such kind of stuff. How will you? This is not a multi-valued thing rather because it is having different part of it. But then to handle that kind of stuff, similar kind of procedure needs to be done. Maybe with some modifications to handle the nested macro definitions. So Tushar, I assume it must have cleared your doubt. Or still no? Yes. Any question, query? No questions? Roshan? Siddhi, Prathamesh, Awad, Vishal. Am I audible by the way? It seems I am only the one who is talking in the class. Yes, please. I'm waiting for your input. Huh?